Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. We are very honored this episode to have Abbot Benedict of Conception Abbey. How are you doing, Abbot Benedict?
Doing very well. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this podcast.
It's great to see you. I've known Abbot Benedict we've known each other for about 25 years when you were Father Benedict and head of the Conception Abbey Seminary. I think it's an honor to have you on here. And can you describe for people what Conception Abbey is and what you do there at the Benedictine Abbey?
We're 100 miles north of Kansas City in Missouri, and we've been here 150 years this year. Founded from a monastery in Switzerland to benefit the immigrant Catholics that had come to this part of Missouri and had no stable priest, and asked the bishop to invite a religious community to come and minister to them. They were most interested in pastoral care and possibly education. The monks from Switzerland were mostly interested in establishing a monastery where they could escape to if necessary, because it was a time in history when monasteries were being suppressed in Europe. So a number of different needs arose, and we happened to fulfill those needs. So we've always had pastoral responsibilities since we've been here, not only here locally at Conception, where we still run the parish that's here, and almost all the parishes in our deanery in this part of Missouri. So we're still doing pastoral work as we did in the beginning, and we're still doing education. Now we run a seminary. In those days, it was a junior college for young men who didn't necessarily intend to become priests, but could also become priests. So we've actually had a seminary program since 1886. In the meantime, we also have a big guest house and retreat program, and we have the Printery House, which makes Christmas cards and other Christian gifts and cards. So we think of ourselves as a kind of leaven in the church. That's what a monastery really is. It isn't supposed to be a powerhouse. It isn't supposed to be a big, exciting place to come and be, but more a kind of spiritual oasis and a spiritual nudge in the community and in the church. Monks are generally not out front like Bishop Barron is, which is a wonderful thing. Monks are kind of in the background, and our main work is not pastoral work or teaching or any of those things that we do, but our main work really is prayer. And that prayer, we believe, and our church believes, that prayer is powerful because prayer reminds us we're not in charge. We're not the big doers and shakers. God is. God often always invites us people to do things and create things and start things and get movements going and get changes happening. But we so often forget that it's God's grace and power that's behind all that. And what monks do is remind themselves, first of all, but others, second of all, that, hey, wait a minute, all these are good things, but God's the one who is in control, who's behind it. And we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. And if we do, then it'll be the power of God and the grace of God that keeps everything moving and changing and improving.
Can you help me fill in some history? I'm hesitant to get us off the spiritual track because I want to go down there too. But when you said that the monks in Switzerland were looking for a foundation in case things went bad in Europe, I'm aware that like Napoleon shut down a bunch of monasteries in the early 1800s. But by the time 1850 is coming around, what was the threat that the Swiss monks were worried about?
In many of those countries that the Napoleonic forces went to after the French Revolution, so in the early 1800s, and Switzerland was one of those countries, they were occupied by Napoleonic forces, and a form of government was imposed that was basically, I wouldn't say it was anti-Catholic, but it was trying to emphasize the secular authority over the spiritual authority in those lands. So it happened in Spain, France for sure, that was the epicenter, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Austria. And in all those countries, laws were passed and kind of an ethos was established that the state should be in charge of institutions rather than the church, especially educational institutions that have such a strong influence. So religious schools were often suppressed or shut. Monasteries had schools, but also monasteries tended to be very supportive of the papacy, and the papacy was considered in many of these lands as a counterweight to the power and authority of the government. And so, especially in more secular societies, and Switzerland was a pretty secular society. There were a number of monasteries suppressed, not all of them. And Engelberg, our mother house, was never suppressed. It's one of the only ones. There were only about 30 monasteries in all of Europe that weren't suppressed after the French Revolution, including all the other religious orders, the Franciscans, Jesuits, and so on. They were all closed down. But Engelberg was one of those 20 or 30. It goes back 900 years continuously. But the threat was there. A number of other Swiss monasteries had been closed. And they worried about that. They actually expected that to happen. So Conception was going to be the refuge for the monks if that did happen, where they would come.
Wow. Most of my life, I've seen kind of secularism as like from an American perspective of like, this is the groundwork in which religion can be fine. Like we have like a diversity of religions. Secularism kind of keeps any one religion from becoming, dictating to the others. And in the last 8 years in America, it started to feel like secularism's actually not just something that might tempt someone to leave the church, but actually a threat, And it's interesting to hear you talk about that was kind of the norm of the 19th century in Europe, that secularism was actually an overt threat to religion.
We use the word secularism now in a different way than they would have. They talked in this period, we're talking about the 1860s, 1870s, of Kulturkampf, the fight of cultures. And it's a religious culture, and it didn't really matter which religion or which denomination of Christianity. And they didn't call it the secular world, they called it really the state power. So it's state power versus church power. And they wanted to assert the authority of the state. That was the French Revolution. The church has so much power, and the royalty, the king had sided with the church, and they were kind of in cahoots. But the people said, no, we want the power. It should be power of the people. It should be the power of what's good for us, not what's good for the church or what's good for the king, but what's good for the people. Now, it went awry in France after the French Revolution. They ended up, killing each other by the dozens and hundreds, not just the religious, but, they didn't have a cohesive sense as we did in America. We also had a revolution where we said, we don't want a king. We don't want an established religion. But we organized ourselves in a way that didn't threaten religion and didn't threaten lives so much. And we became the ideal. And all these other European countries were trying to remodel themselves and their government similar to what the Americans had accomplished. But in the process, they felt they had to get rid of some of these old established institutions that were hundreds, thousands of years old. And in order to get this free nation that isn't controlled by a church, they didn't see themselves as anti-religion. They all went to church, their own church. Even the Catholics, went to church, but they didn't want the monasteries or the Jesuits were the particular target of this animosity because they seemed to be above the law, above the government, because they were international, and we want our national values to be expressed.
So they weren't trying to stamp out religion. They were just trying to take the religious flavor out of some of the major institutions like education and maybe hospitals or other things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. One of the thinkers I follow has said that everyone 200 years ago was like so religious that it's hard for us to fathom. And I think what he means by that is like sometimes we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson or something as like Thomas Jefferson said some things that weren't that Christian or weren't Christian. But when you actually read his writings, you realize this guy thought about God all the time. This guy wrote about God all the time. This guy was even if he disagrees with you, he's way more religious than what we think of as like a doubting person today, And that people were willing to even go to war for these things is like a different level of religiosity or belief than I think we're used to.
Right.
Well, that's all interesting. And Switzerland has multiple language groups within it, right? And it's
4 different language groups, yeah.
And is the Engelberg, is that right? What was that within like one quarter, or was that was it all 4 mixed, or what was that like?
No, it was in the German speaking part of Switzerland. So those monks spoke German. Now, Swiss German is a kind of a dialect of German. There are many dialects in the German language in Germany as well. So they didn't necessarily communicate all that well with others, but they spoke a version of German, a dialect of German.
Was there ever a time that Conception Abbey actually did function as a refuge, like in World War I or World War II? Monks might have traveled there in order to get away?
Yes. Especially in World War II, there were a number of religious who had to leave Europe because of things they might have said, especially in Germany. And many of them came to the United States, and some of them were professors and so on. We had probably 4 professors in our seminary who had been trained and had taught in European, mostly German institutions, but couldn't at that time and came to the United States. And sometimes after World War I, it had more to do with poverty than with political situations. But the religious houses in Europe were so devastated, especially in Austria and Germany, maybe Belgium, after World War I, that they couldn't afford to support all of their people. So many of them came to the United States just for economic reasons.
To avoid starvation.
Yeah.
Is it that desperate or?
Yeah, and to send money back.
Right.
Make money in the United States just like the guest workers have done over the centuries, and make enough that they can actually send money back to Europe to help support their brothers and sisters in religious life.
So something that struck me about your monastery in particular is that I work with a lot of young people, and when they come and they say they have like a desire to, pursue a religious vocation, they'll often have an order they're looking at or what, right? And a lot of orders have a certain type that they seem to like look for, right? Like you can't imagine just anyone becoming a missionary of charity. You can't imagine just anyone becoming a Dominican. I mean, if someone's not suitable to get a PhD, I almost would recommend they pursue a Dominican vocation, But I feel like your abbey in particular is one of a few where I'm like, no matter who they are, if they're like a nerd, a scholar, simple or whoever type they are, I feel like you guys have a way to find a role for someone in your community. Does that seem accurate to you?
We do have a very big variety of personalities and interests and abilities. I would admit that's true. But we have a variety of works too. We have a school, so anybody who's interested in teaching can find an interesting livelihood in that. We have a lot of pastoral outlets, so people with a pastoral bent would be able to feel at home. We have a lot of manual labor that needs to be done, and that's very much a part of our history as a monastery. So somebody who's interested in being a horticulturist, or to work with animals, or to work with wood, could be happy in our monastery. But I think the thing that distinguishes somebody who's attracted to a monastery is he's comfortable with praying 3 hours a day. That's a lot of time. And he's comfortable with the liturgy of the hours and praying in that way. I'm not saying they all have to be contemplatives in the strongest form of that type, but they have to have a contemplative strain to whatever other interests and so on they have.
My understanding of religious history is that the very first, what you might call religious order, is the monks, maybe coming out of Egypt or Greece, and that in the West, this has become the Benedictines, and that only later you get the friars and the Franciscans and Dominicans, then you get the like apostolic orders. What do you think is that's just interesting that for a long time, for, I don't know, maybe like 800 years or so, correct me if these dates are all off, but there was like the option was to become a monk. You weren't choosing between all the others. Is there anything special about monasticism, you think, about it being kind of that primal or first religious movement? And then also, do you think there's anything particularly special about it today, given the much more big landscape of even new orders being founded in the last century that have done quite well?
I would say the connection between monks and them being kind of the only option for a religious way of life, or a dedicated religious way of life, other than just regular practice of one's faith, has more to do with an agricultural society because of our stability, because monks stay in the same place, typically. That is, and the centuries where monasticism was dominant in terms of religious life were centuries where that stability was necessary, and that they were really the only places where culture, cultivation, and cult, to quote some older writers, could be developed at monasteries. These were the periods of the barbarian, what we call the barbarian tribes, Germanic tribes, moving in and out in Europe. And the monks and the knights are the only two places that were really safe. The knights built castles, the monks built monasteries. And those were the stable, secure places that people could go. The monks weren't as worried about, just saving their lives, and many of them lost their lives. Many of them were plundered and so on. But they were interested, and it was a sign to the people that we all need to stay in one place. We need to develop our sense of commitment to God and praise of God. We need a beautiful church to do that. We need gardens and farms to feed ourselves. We need to establish centers where Christianity can develop and flourish. And that was the attraction. Now, as society changed in the 1200s and became more urban and more fluid, different needs arose. You needed mendicants, and you needed people who would follow the crowds or go into the cities. And the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and then later the Jesuits and others met those needs that changed with society. But the monastic instinct, I think, is still needed in every age and in every place. And that is that stability, that decision to stay here, stay with these people who are here, who can't leave, probably, and who need the sacraments and who need to give themselves over to God as well as to their work and their family and so on. So we represent stability. The others represent more other virtues that are needed in their time and in our time.
This does another historical question that comes out of what you're saying. When the monks, I feel like the early monks were still in the Roman Empire, maybe where there was more order and there wasn't the barbarian issue, but when the monks started offering security, does that mean that the brothers would take up arms to defend the monastery, or the abbot was like managing the villagers into a little army or militia? Or what was the...
I don't know my early medieval history well enough to know how prevalent that might have been. But I do know churches were often built as fortresses. The west side of a church has these two big towers typically from that period. And they were the place of protection that everybody would gather.
Those towers had a military significance? Is that what you're saying? That's amazing.
They had a symbolic meaning. They're facing west. The sun comes up from the east. That's the side of the rising of the sun, of the risen Savior. The east is toward the Savior. The west is protection against the evil. The evil is trying to come against, the Savior, the rising sun. So symbolically or spiritually, those west towers are signs of protection from evil. But if the evil that's coming is an army, it can also be a good protection there too.
Right. The way you're talking about the significance of monasticism, um, when I meet young people choosing religious life, there tends to be more of a, like, what was your attraction that made you become a monk? What is kind of like a description of how you found Conception Abbey and monasticism?
When I was a boy, growing up in a big family in Kansas City in the 1950s, so it was pre-Vatican II, I wanted to be a parish priest. I admired the priests in our parish, and my parents and family admired them, and we were strong Catholics.
What was your parish, Abbot Benedict?
Visitation in Kansas City.
Great.
And of course, we all went to the parish grade school, and we all went to Catholic high school. The church really was our life and our social world. All of my friends I knew from school. And so having a profession or a vocation in the church was a natural thing to think about. I was the only one in my big family that chose it, but it wasn't that odd. And it represented really continuing our family traditions, because they were so rooted in the church and in our faith. So I went to our high school seminary in Kansas City, St. John's, and went to a year at Conception, always intending in that direction towards being a parish priest, diocesan priest. But in my senior year in high school, I discovered there were other religious orders. And I met a Maryknoll priest, and I started imagining myself as a missionary. And a cousin of my father was a missionary in Bolivia. She was a Dominican sister, and one of the first in that wave of North Americans that went down to Central and South America. So in the 50s, I knew of this sister, and she had visited our family many times. And I started imagining myself in a religious community. And so I asked the vocation director, could I study to be a missionary? And he said, go to Conception for a year. And if you still want to be a missionary after 1 year at Conception, fine. Then you can go off to the Maryknolls. And I did.
Abbot Benedict, when you were going, I know you've been mentioning the 1950s, when you actually were entering college, was it the 60s or late 60s, or when was it?
It was the late 60s. I entered college in 67.
So this is also the time of like hippies, of the sexual revolution, post-Vatican II at this point, right? An explosion of drug use, recreational drug use, things like this. Was this something that you were rubbing elbows with or seeing, or were you kind of sheltered from this, or?
No, I was seeing it. I wasn't involved in the drug culture, it was mostly marijuana, or at least that I was aware of. But I certainly saw it. And that's why I left seminary after a couple of years. I left in 1970. I did go join the Maryknollers, their college seminary, for a year and a half. But there was so much change and disruption to the old steadiness and stability that I had known as a kid. I realized I was about 20 years old, 21. I have a fifth grade vocation. I have never really matured in my vocation. I've matured in my intellect. I've matured in my understanding of different things. But I had not really come to own my vocation as a future priest. And the world was changing. The church was changing around me. Many of my seminary friends were leaving the seminary. Some of the seminary professors who were ordained priests were leaving. And so I left.
Can you pause there? I once met a priest who showed me this like ordination photo of him and 25 guys. And he says, yeah, this photo, me and one other guy are still priests. And I think the photo was taken in the 70s, right? Can you help people kind of who today, in their 20s and 30s haven't seen any of this? Can you help people like fathom, was it just this enormous falling away? Like you show up to theology class one day and in the middle of the night, your theology professor took off and became a hippie, or like what was happening? Or I also want to know like how antagonistic was it? Was it like the church is the conservatives and these are the liberals and we're fighting? Or was it like, hey, we need to figure out a way to evangelize this new generation that's going through all this change? Or what was the attitude going on then? Or was it just confusion?
I think it was, we were all on automatic pilot for a long time. It seemed like a long time. Probably wasn't, but maybe for the 10 or 15 years since World War II, I actually attribute the change that happened more to World War II and that total change in society that happened because of World War II or since World War II. But we were kind of on automatic pilot in the church. We were given a model. It was the Bishop Sheen model, maybe you could say, or the, I don't know, it was just the stable, steady model, and the smartest kids in the class went into the seminary or the convent, and they were running the church and had been, we thought, for centuries, really only for decades, but and we were all kind of just running on this automatic pilot. We had the script, we had the answers, and we had the status, and we had the image of what a stable, successful life would look like. That all just vanished very quickly. Now, it happened to be right at the end of Vatican II. I don't want to say it's Vatican II. I want to say Vatican II said, hey, change is okay, even in the church. But our society had already been saying that for a couple of decades. Hey, change is good. Change is okay. You don't have to follow your parents into their profession. You don't have to do everything that was scripted for your life like your parents did and, the generation before you. You can have your own imagination of what the future would be. And all of a sudden, and I don't think it was just in the church, but we really felt it in the church. Women, instead of saying, I either become a mother or a nurse or a teacher, now I have all kinds of other options, and I'm going to pursue them. I'm not going to just follow my dad into whatever profession he practiced. And in the 50s and the 40s, you did pretty much either follow your parent or you decided at a young age, by the end of high school, you kind of decided your career. Now that's all gone. That's all up in the air.
You kind of mentioned that the church from World War II up till the 60s or 70s was being run one way that was maybe not the same thing as like the 1800s or the 1700s, right? Are you saying that this autopilot period was more regimented and structured than even like the 19th century and 18th century? Is that what you're saying? Or how are you saying that period after World War II that kind of got broken after a while, how was that different than the past? I sense that too, but I don't know I haven't put my finger on it the way you're trying to.
Well, let me add a little color. Maybe this will help a little bit. I mean, this is the time of the sexual revolution, that, the sexual roles are not all determined. The time of the racial changes, were civil rights. Back in the 19th century, yes, and in in the 80s and 90s, there were definitions, and there were, this is what it means to be a hippie. This is what it means to be a feminist. This is what it means to be a, revolutionary, a druggie, or whatever. So, I mean, it's not that all of a sudden we found a real freedom, but we've just found a different set of a different book to read from, that we were writing. We thought we were writing ourselves, or our generation was writing the script instead of our parents' generation writing the script. That was the feeling. And the feeling was of liberation and of freedom, freedom to think for yourself, freedom to really choose. Now, I think we've discovered, I don't know how many people are really aware of it, but it was just a new kind of slavery. It wasn't really a liberation. And every generation in the 19th century has its, slaveries or its slavish adherence to a particular script that we're supposed to follow. But it also had its genuine heroes and genuine people who were willing to give themselves for something bigger. And the 60s had that too. I mean, isn't that when Mother Teresa really rises? And so it's not one picture, but this experience, which I was in that 50s church that really changed in the 60s and 70s. And the people were good-hearted. They weren't insincere. It isn't as though they had been cynical in all their activities as seminarians and priests, earlier, and now are sincere for the first time. They were always sincere, and they were dedicated to their work. But all of a sudden, they could do something different than what they were doing and get away with it. The cultural pressures were relieved. The family pressures were relieved. Families didn't know. They weren't crazy about the fact that their sister, who had been a nun for 10 years, left the convent at the time. But at the same time, they thought, well, this is what makes her happy. That's fine. So the feeling of restriction was taken away, and people took advantage of that. And it was very hard on the ones who didn't do that. Hard psychologically. Am I the only one? Because some of the smartest people in our group have left. Am I staying because I can't handle life in the big world? Because I don't have, the competence to go out and make a living, and so on. So there was a lot of psychological upset too, on both sides, and the ones who left and the ones who stayed. And it's taking a long time for that to settle.
Now so you weren't quite like the nun for 10 years, but you were in seminary, and then you left to kind of like explore what all these other options are. Is that right? And what did you end up doing when you left?
I finished college in Colorado, thinking I would be a forest ranger. That was kind of an option, which I later realized I just liked being out in the woods. I didn't really want to make my living as a forest ranger. I just wanted to be in the woods. So I tested that, tried that, dropped it, went into the field that I was most interested in, which was history, got my degree in history. And then I went to Germany, and I thought it was to extend my learning, maybe get a degree at a German university someday. But once I got there and I realized, wow, I don't know German that well to go to a university, I started working with my hands. I worked in a tree nursery for a couple of years, and then I got into woodworking, and I discovered that whole side of my personality and interest.
In Germany?
In Germany. I was there for 5 years. And I thought I would become a woodworker. But I also discovered while I was there all these Benedictine abbeys. Bavaria is full of abbeys, some of them still functioning or functioning again. They had all been closed in the Napoleonic era, but probably 20 of them were reopened in the meantime.
Can I ask, during this period of the sexual revolution, did it feel like America was following Europe or Europe was following America, or was it a truly, at the same time type thing?
I lived in Europe 5 years, and I could not tell that there was as much a sexual, promiscuity as one thought there was in the United States. And I don't know that there was in the United I wasn't promiscuous myself, so I wasn't traveling in those circles. But I didn't see a lot of it. So I can't answer your question really, even though I lived there at that time. But people seemed to be more respectful of each other's sexuality than I thought was the case in the United States. I would have thought in the United States it was much more of a thing.
Like there was not a European Woodstock that you're aware of?
No.
Okay.
But I'm not a good judge of all that.
Okay, good. All right. Let's go back to your story then.
Well, then the story is over there, I discovered monasticism. Even though I went a year to school at Conception Abbey or Conception Seminary, I didn't really discover monasticism as a way of life. But over there, I saw it, and I saw how it affected the culture in the past, and how these monastic centers had really become the center of their civilization in the Middle Ages. And I became curious, and I went to visit a monastery over there. I didn't think I could become a member. I didn't think I could go back into seminary or religious life because I had left. I don't know where I got that idea, but I thought, you get one chance, and if you say no, well, okay, go find something else. So I presented that to a monk at a monastery there in Germany, and I said, he said, are you interested? And I said, I'm interested, but I realize I can't do it. And he said, why? Why can't you do it? I told him my theory that I had imagined. And he said, baloney, that's, I'm sure you can. So then that opened up the possibility of religious life to me. And I went to visit a number of times. That monastery was called Ettal, near Oberammergau, where I was living at the time. And I liked it. I liked the monks, but I felt like my vocation really was back to the United States. And I'd been there 5 years, and I thought, it's time to go back. So I did. I came back to the United States.
Was Joseph Ratzinger like a figure that you knew about or followed at that time?
Not yet. He was a theologian, and I may have heard of him in the seminary because he was a theologian, peritus at Vatican II. I wouldn't say I followed him. He was not yet the bishop in Munich Freising when I lived there. Döpfner was the cardinal and archbishop at the time, who was at Vatican II, who was the bishop at Vatican II. And I think Ratzinger followed him, or maybe one or two in between, before he became Archbishop of Munich. But I was there before he was a bishop.
Well, let's get back to your story.
It really was in Europe that I discovered the monastic vocation. And part of it, too, I would have to say is there were times when I was very lonely and homesick even. Homesick to the degree that I was sick for weeks on end. And it wasn't common. I mean, most of the time I was not homesick, but I came down with, the only thing I could attribute it to was this kind of homesickness. But anyway, in my loneliness, I turned back to the Mass and to the Rosary. And they really helped me in this period. And so I started going to daily Mass in this little village. And I started saying the Rosary every evening, go for a walk along the mountainside and come home. And my roommate had shared a kind of an apartment with a roommate, and he'd go off drinking with all the rest of our classmates in the wood carving school that I was at. And I had no interest in that and no desire. So I would pray. And I mean, it was really something new for me, but it was very helpful. And that to me really was a sign that I belonged in a praying type community rather than a real active, even parish setting. And that fit. When I did start going to visit this monastery, I mentioned, it really fit. Monks pray. That makes sense to me now. And they work with their hands. That makes sense to me now. So it was a conversion to some extent, but also a discovery of myself. And I think I had always been that kind of a kid too, that was quiet and not in the middle of things. I was ambitious to learn and ambitious for, I don't know, recognition, but not for action. I was not a go-getter and a big doer. And monasticism seemed to provide that context where I could develop my interests and abilities, but not out front, more in the background.
So I want to ask you about your return to the U.S. and becoming a monk here, but you're talking about vocation kind of as like a natural fit in a certain way, like it suited you well, right? And that makes sense. But then also these religious life is actually not a natural thing. It's not something that you see in all the cultures of the world. I mean, there's monks in Buddhism and things, but it's kind of a different flavor than what we have, There's something supernatural about it, kind of like priestly celibacy. It's not natural, it's supernatural, right? I once met a guy, this struck me once, that I was working with a guy who was, I think this guy's done very well. So, but he was like everything that like, almost like, but a Hollywood star, but he was like, becoming a religious, right? Like He had played soccer. Every girl would swoon when he walked by. He had an earring, everything like this, right? And I remember talking to his formator a couple years later, and I just asked after him, and I said, "Is he doing well?" And he was like, "Yeah, he's doing great." And I go, and he asked me why I asked, and I was like, "Well, celibacy is always a miracle, but it seems like it's a bigger miracle for some people than others." I guess I'm curious the way you're describing this, that monasticism just fit you, but I feel like this idea of giving your life to the monastery is like fundamentally like a miracle or a supernatural gift, not a, hey, I was born to like manual labor and prayer and therefore I fit here. Would you kind of like help, like when you talk to a guy with a vocation, how do you weigh that?
Well, I did have a girlfriend over there, and I did consider marriage pretty seriously. She considered it a lot more strongly than I did. And that was also part of helping me realize some of what I was looking for, maybe would not be found in marriage or in, following that instinct and certainly that desire. Yeah, I don't think I was born a monk, but I think when I was introduced to it, it suited me. And I had to be introduced more than just a casual introduction. I had to get into it, and I had to need it, which I did. And that's perhaps the supernatural part, that I do feel I was led to it. And didn't just stumble into it, but I was led to it. And it took a while. I was 30 years old before I entered the monastery.
So you've considered entering the monastery in Germany, and then at some point you returned to the U.S., right? What did you do upon your return to the U.S.?
Joined a small monastery in upstate New York. I did some research over there. What are the small monasteries? I don't want a big monastery that has a school or parishes. I want a small monastery with more of a manual labor emphasis. And I discovered one called Mount Savior in upstate New York. And I went there on my way back from Europe and liked it, joined. And I was there for over a year. And they said, "We don't think you have a vocation to this monastery. We think you need more community life." They considered themselves more like Trappists. I loved it. I thought it was perfect for me, but they thought I needed community. And they were right, but I didn't know that. So I left upset and crushed and unsure of what I should do next. Took me a year or so working as a carpenter. And I would come up to Conception once a month to see my spiritual director, a monk I had known when I was a student here. And to help me, put together all this confusion in my life, I would come and talk to him, and it was very helpful. And then one month, maybe a year, not even a year, 6-8 months into it, I had planned to go up on a particular weekend, and he wrote me or called me and said, this would have been about 1978, 79. He said, a conflict has come up. I'm not going to be able to be there this weekend. And I said, that's okay. I like to come up there anyway. I'll just come up and enjoy the weekend. And then I realized, I'm not just going up there to see him. I'm going up there because I really like being at Conception. Even though it's the antithesis of what I thought I was looking for. It's a big monastery with a big school and, parishes, and who knows what the monks will be doing if you join this monastery. But I did feel at home. And finally I overcame my fear and resistance to trying it again, having felt I had failed in this other venture. I was able to overcome that with the help of the spiritual director, and I finally did apply and join. And from then on, I realized, no, this was right. The image I had in my mind was, I grew up in a neighborhood, and the girl next door and I were really good buddies growing up. But there's this gorgeous girl that I went to school with, and I, dated this gorgeous girl who was the perfect one, and she dumped me, but it was really the girl next door that I had grown up with, that I really belonged with. And Conception was that, the girl I grew up with, and, this is home.
Oh, that's great. I have a question about, so as abbot, and you've also been president of the seminary, which there's a little bit of this next question in both those roles. You're kind of in charge of helping set the tone or the scene at your abbey, right? And most people who listen to this will have never been to Conception Abbey, but Conception Abbey is kind of it's not within a city. It's kind of its own city in a sense. It's up on a hill, and there's a few houses next to it, but really it's the center of the location. Almost perfectly in the sense of an abbey. It's not like an abbey in downtown Chicago, and it's a place where, I feel like this is probably your desire, but it's also just true that, like, you employ people from the community. People travel to you who aren't even Catholic. I've met people who just came to Conception while I was there, who were just curious, who saw it on the map and came to see what it was, and it's the type of place that someone who is used to cussing would walk in and not feel like cussing, or at least try not to, what I mean? Like it's trying to elevate, in a sense, people's behavior and call, and, you almost feel more spiritual when you arrive. Right. And I know that don't be insulted by this, Abbot Benedict, but it's almost like if you ran a nightclub, you'd have to have a certain scene you're trying to create with the lighting, the music, the people you're going to have, the decor, the location, right? To create this certain, I don't want to call it magic, but this this atmosphere, as abbot, do you feel like that's kind of your job, is to foster that, and what do you do? How do you make decisions related to that? What's your goals with that?
I would have a harder time answering that question a year ago. But now that I've been abbot almost a whole 7 years, which isn't really very long for abbots, but I realize what setting a tone means, and it's more unconscious than conscious. I know it mainly because people tell me, you're setting this tone. It isn't something I set out to do. It isn't something I'm trying to do consciously. But even before I became abbot, starting when I was rector, and it was more a form of exercise and getting outside. I love being outside. I'm forest ranger, the frustrated forest ranger. I started mowing trails, some of which had been established by our brother Damien in the day, and others that I established. And I did it for two reasons. One, to get out on the mower and be out in nature, but also so that people would have a place to walk, a quiet place to walk, a beautiful place to walk. And I've spent a lot of my free time trimming trees to beautify the grounds. And lately, we had a monk who's built a beautiful flower garden next to our infirmary, and then left. So I picked it up and I take care of this garden. And it's huge now. It's got all kinds of flowers and it takes a lot of time. But there are always, and this isn't the main thing I wanted to say, but I want this to be a beautiful place. I want it to be a place of peace, because I believe that's what monasteries are, kind of an oasis in a noisy, chaotic world. And I'm not blaming the world for being chaotic. We're just as chaotic ourselves in this monastery as the rest of the world. We're no different. It's somewhat of a sign to my brother monks, take care of this treasure we've been given, and I'll show you. I'm willing to do that. But the main thing, the tone I try to set is not to overreact and not to be a crisis manager, even when there are crises that have to be managed. To look at life as this all fits into God's plan. And we just have to slow down and listen and look and see how God's acting in our world and in ourselves, and then cooperate with that. We don't have to go out and create a brave new world. We don't have to do all these fantastic, wonderful things for the world to be good. The world is good. God is good. God is blessing us. And but we forget it and we ignore it and we get so self-focused, and I do too, that my job as abbot is to kind of tone down the crisis mentality and this is the first time this has ever happened to me or to us mentality.
And part of your pastoring of this kind of scene and of this place is you're also setting each monk in a role, right? And I kind of got from what you said earlier in this interview that monks have certain interests or things they're more suited to, like being a teacher or being grounds or being a carpenter, right? And you're kind of, are you trying to fit them all into this place in a way that they flourish? Is that a lot of your job?
That is a lot of my job, and it's very complex because I can't just go out and hire monks who are suited. They come. So I have a fixed group to work with, and it's their decision to be here, not mine. But we've got a lot of work to do, and we are all monks. We have a spiritual work to do, but really the spiritual work is getting all of them to work together, accomplishing the spiritual purposes that we have, even though there might be better people out there who could do it better than we can, any individual. But I have to figure out how we can get these guys, the ones we have. It's like, in a family, you don't get to choose your kids, but you got to make it all work with those kids. And that's both a challenge, but also a satisfying thing to realize it's not a fine-tuned organization. That's not the goal. That everything works well and perfectly. Excellence, yes, that's a desire, but the goal is not excellence. The goal is that all these guys come to Christ and that they help others come to Christ. And sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's incompetent, and sometimes it's, by the seat of your pants. A lot of times it is excellent, and more times than we deserve, it's beautiful. but that isn't the be all and the end all.
In some older kind of religious writings, I feel like, I don't even know which ones I'm citing, but I feel like these, maybe the medieval, like Cloud of Unknowing type writings, or Imitation of Christ, maybe, Thomas à Kempis, where it's like, there's an idea that in monastic life, there should not be particular friendships. Like you should just kind of love humanity and almost be distant from individuals within humanity, you know? And I found this idea interesting and kind of impossible, you know? I think, I can't remember the saint now. Was de Sales friends with a certain nun that they used to exchange letters? I can't remember who it was, but
yes, a lot of them were.
Right.
Sinclair and a lot of the great saints had particular friends that.
Right. And as if that's like necessary to get through life. I'm kind of curious, like in a monastery like yours, just to add one more piece of flavor to this, is for a couple years when I was at University of Kansas, I lived in this kind of hippie co-op called the Sunflower House. And it was like 30 people. And when I arrived, I was told this community is 30 people. That's a really good number because you're going to find a certain crew that you want to be around and a certain crew you don't want to be around. And it's big enough that you can kind of avoid the people you want to avoid most of the time and, hang out with people you want to hang out with most of the time, which is kind of an interesting comment on particular friendship, right? How does that work in your community? Is it something that you try to like pat down, hey, these two guys are real good buds, or even for you yourself, like how does that work in a modern Benedictine community like yours?
I have always had friends in the community and needed them. So I don't think it's a bad thing. It is sometimes misinterpreted, and sometimes people are jealous of it because they don't have it. That kind of that level of support. So I don't find genuine friendship is a bad thing in a religious community. It can be difficult, and there do need to be some ground rules that it shouldn't prevent you from relating to the rest of the community. It shouldn't shield you completely from the people you don't like. You should still relate to them. Or who don't like you, you should still relate to them. You need them. And that's part of why we live in a community, is that we help each other get to heaven. All of it, everyone, not just one or two. But as abbot, it is a little more complicated. It's kind of like a parent. A parent tries not to show that he or she only likes this one, but each one is special. Each one is, his or her favorite. And kind of as abbot, I have to do a little bit of that too, of showing sufficient care and attention to all of them as well as I can. It's impossible we have 56 monks. I can't devote a lot of time and attention to each one. But I do have to be careful not to neglect anybody.
I've got a big picture question now that I think you'll have better perspective on than me. So I work with seminaries, and I've worked with seminaries I've been around seminaries since the late 90s till today, and I feel like the type of vocation that I see and the type of seminarian and even their experience at seminary seems to be better now than it was. And I've often attributed this to a turning point that I see in my own life, which is like this sex abuse crisis breaking in 2001, 2002, that it was no longer like a lot of worldly applause for going into religious life or to the priesthood. It was like if you're doing it for the right reasons, because you're not doing it for the pay, you're not doing it for the glory, you know. And I also know that I want to throw in two other things before I let you just kind of explain how you view this. You guys at Conception not only had the what the whole church went through in America, which is the sex abuse crisis, and the visitation of seminaries, which I'm curious to hear anything about that you want to share. But you also had the shooting that happened at Conception Abbey a couple years before that, or I don't know. It was before
2002.
That's the same year as the sex abuse crisis, isn't it?
Pretty much.
Pretty
we
much
didn't connect the two. But
right. Well, no, I do remember it happening afterwards, because I remember wondering, you know, like it could even be that I'm curious if you know anything about the motives of the shooter, but like he didn't have a connection, or we don't know of any abuse he suffered, but it could have been there was this rage against the Catholic Church during that period, you know. And then to throw one more thing on top of this complex situation, there's kind of been this disappearance of the blue collar vocation. Like the brother Damien who died in that shooting was very much a blue collar monk. Like he mowed, he took care of the grounds. And it was a beautiful vocation he had. Very much, he was almost the guest welcomer, is the way I felt, you know. He knew everyone who came to the monastery. You just don't see it. Like I talked to the Dominicans out in Washington, D.C., and they haven't had a brother vocation in like decades, was the sense I had. And there used to be a thriving group of brothers within their order. Can you talk about all of that, this changing nature of vocations, and whether or not that turning point I'm pointing out is the real turning point?
Well, certainly the turning point in religious life for the decrease in vocations to the blue collar professions, or, you know, that came from Vatican II, which said religious orders need to recover the inspiration of their founder and get rid of class distinctions. So all members of any of these religious orders, instead of having two tiers where some make solemn vows and are chapter members and can vote on things, and others are lay brothers, laity, not religious, who don't take solemn vows, who don't have vote in chapter, and so on. That all got merged after Vatican II. And I think that's the source of this lack of variety. We all see ourselves in one fashion. Now, curiously, in recent years in our monastery, and I think in other monasteries, there is a resurgence of interest in manual labor and those things, to the detriment of vocations to priesthood. We are having a heck of a time covering the pastoral and priestly needs of our community. We've had to lead many parishes back to the diocese, and we can't fill in and help out like we used to. But I don't see that as related to the sex abuse crisis. What I do think may be related, and it happened throughout the church, we've gotten a lot more careful about signs of bad behavior and learned how to recognize signs in a person who, you know, works in the church. I don't know if for a long time, and it was before awareness of the sex abuse scandal, but families were not very supportive of sons and daughters going into religious life. And, you know, I'm not exactly sure what all that had to do with, but That was the case when I was rector in the 90s and early 20s, early 2000s. There were a lot of guys in the seminary who didn't have the support of their family. And they weren't doing it, as a sign of independence always, but they had difficulties. They had their own problems that they were dealing with. And a lot of seminary administration was helping guys deal with problems. And there were more emotional issues, I think, in those days than there are today among the seminarians and probably among the monks. Although they say nowadays, and I see signs of it, there's a lot of anxiety in the young people. Not dysfunction so much as anxiety, fear of failure, fear of the future. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And we see it in the guys entering the monastery. They're well-meaning and they're willing to, look at those fears, but they're not as willing to take chances or do unusual things. They're kind of used to a more predictable way of life. But our guys are, I would say, our seminarians, and I still teach all the seminarians an introduction to theology, so I get to know a little bit about how they think and who they are. They're pretty dedicated. They do have the support of their families, by and large, and they're idealistic. They tend to be traditional, which I think is a good thing. There are a lot of good things. I'm not sure the retention rate is going to be a whole lot higher. Hope it is, but they definitely are good guys and solid candidates. If they do, when and if they do become priests, they will be good priests.
How significant was the visitation of seminaries from the Vatican after the sex abuse scandal? Was that significant for you guys, or was it just like a guy came, looked around, left, or what?
It was a team that came. It was a little uncomfortable, and they were, pretty businesslike about the whole thing. But we passed, and as did most everyone else. I don't know that it made a big change in the way seminaries were run, but I guess just the fact that they were visited helped us, and probably people in the pew grow in their confidence a little bit that if there are problems, they're being addressed and rooted out.
I'm just going to ask a second question on that. My sense was that some seminaries closed after this, and I don't know that that's related or not. I wanted to know if you thought it was related to the visitation. Washington Theological Seminary is one I'm thinking of. But the other thing is, I also got the sense that one of the things they were looking for was homosexual subcultures and things that may have somehow been allowed to exist within these institutions, Is your sense that there was any meaningful reform with that? Or like you said, maybe it was just to help the laity regain faith, or what?
That wasn't a focus here anyway, as I remember, the homosexual subcultures. It might have been more in the theologates than at the college level. And that too might be more a developmental thing. At the college level, guys are still discovering who they are in a more basic way than a little bit later. I think the awareness that sexuality is a big part of human nature and it can't be ignored or neglected during seminary times forced us all to pay more attention to that. So in our setting, we had already, back in the 60s, started a program called character formation. Now it's called human formation generally. But that didn't used to be a big concern in seminaries. The guys were considered mature when they got there. And there wasn't a lot of guidance besides just normal human observing one another about helping guys mature well, and sexuality being a part of that. That got more emphasis in the 90s and especially probably in the 2000s after the sex abuse crisis. And really the sex abuse crisis had a flare up in the 90s as well, the early 90s. You probably didn't catch it at your age, but I did focus more and more attention on this human formation issue. And we gave it a lot of attention. And I think other seminaries did too. And then it started showing up in Roman documents, the program for priestly formation. The early versions of it, and those just started in the 60s and 70s. Every about 10 years, a new instruction would come from Rome saying, here are the minimum requirements for seminaries. In the 2000s, human formation started taking on a bigger role and almost a dominant role. And I attribute that to Pope John Paul II. He put a big emphasis on that. Pastoris Dabo Vobis. So I wouldn't attribute it only to the sex abuse crisis or that visitation, but certainly that period is when that becomes more dominant.
So something else, changing subjects. This is one of my last questions, actually, but one of the things that I've seen that I think is kind of beautiful that I've never heard a monk of Conception advertise, but like I've seen a lot of religious orders go to Conception, meaning like I've been in the retreat house and met religious there on retreat. I've seen the Little Brothers and Sisters of the Lamb, which is one of the most influential communities in the Kansas City area, go there for some type of thing. I think it might have been for just fundraising advice, but and then the Gower Benedictines have gone there, and even there's this other abbey that's also very popular right now in Oklahoma, Clear Creek. And I have this memory of Father Lawrence, before that abbey was founded, coming to Conception from France to become part of the American culture before founding a monastery in the US. I also have this memory of him, like when they would mow the enormous lawns at Conception, he'd be out there with a push mower in the Missouri summer while everyone else was on a riding mower, just to get his kind of like labor in for the day. What is do you feel like your abbey or monks in general have this role of even nurturing other religious life within the church?
It's not a conscious role or intention on our part. We had this summer, and have for a number of summers, we had Dominicans from all over the country had a workshop here, and Jesuit retreat before ordination for the Midwest. All their guys came here on retreat. we do get a lot of religious. I instituted, but I think previous abbots did too, a basic rule that if a religious comes, we don't charge them. And we want them to come. We want them to have a place to go to, find a retreat or a peaceful setting or get advice. You're right. The Little Sisters initially of the Lamb asked us to help them get a grant when they were building their monastery. And we had previously gotten a grant from the same group that they were looking towards. And so somebody had advised them, well, Conception got a grant from them. Maybe they can help you. So we did. And then when the Little Brothers built their place, we did the same thing with them. And have told them again and again, please come up and use our place anytime you want. 2 of them were here for a month this summer, of the Little Brothers. They sent me a check afterwards, and I sent it back. And I said, oh, you guys can use this better than we can. I'm proud of the fact that we can be a place where they are at home. They join us in choir if they want, if they feel comfortable, and we're happy to have them.
And you've also been a great kind of, as if you're kind of like fertilizing all these different initiatives in the church. You've helped Simple House, and we still have our dining room tables from Conception Abbey. And I remember you delivering some furniture to us in a box truck one time. And I just want to thank you for all that. And also Michael Kerwin, who we've mentioned in some of our early podcasts, founded a Catholic Worker, and you were good friends with him. And I found the Catholic Worker movement through your friendship with Michael Kerwin out in Washington, D.C. So I want to thank you for all that, Abbot Benedict, and thank you for always hosting the Simple House retreats too.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we can. And I think all our monks would share that feeling of being happy that we can share our life.
Well, is there anything you else would like to say, Abbot Benedict?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the work of a Simple House, which is not very simple, I'm sure, but it has a very simple ideal and idea. And that simple idea is that human beings are more important than programs. And that's a wonderful thing to help young people realize.
Thank you so much, Abbot Benedict. You've been a blessing to us. And thank you for listening to the Simpleton Podcast. Like, subscribe, and share it. And please visit Conception Abbey.